By June 1946, the war had been over in Europe for more than a year. The fighting was finished. Hitler was dead. Germany was occupied. Cities lay in ruins. Families were scattered. Millions of men were still trying to find their way home. But in Michigan, at Fort Custer near Battle Creek, there were still German prisoners of war waiting for orders. They had come to America as captured enemies. Some had been taken in North Africa. Some had worn the uniform of the Afrika Korps. Some were young men who had never seen the United States until they crossed the Atlantic in prison custody. They arrived behind barbed wire. They left by train. And when the last large group of German prisoners boarded a special train out of Fort Custer in June 1946, the mood was not simple. A Battle Creek newspaper described it as a scene of mixed emotions. Some men smiled, some joked, others looked worried. They were going home. But home, for many of them, no longer existed as they remembered it. This is the story of the German POWs who worked in Michigan's fields, forests, and food plants during World War II, and the strange final chapter when some of them did not want to leave. When Americans think of World War II, they usually picture Europe, the Pacific, Pearl Harbor, Normandy, Iwo Jima, or the factories of Detroit. But the war also came home in a quieter way. It came in the form of captured enemy soldiers. During World War II, the United States held more than 425,000 prisoners of war. Most were German, others were Italian or Japanese. They were moved from battlefields overseas to camps across the United States. Michigan became part of that national POW system. According to the Archives of Michigan, more than 6,000 POWs were housed in the state. About 1,000 were held in the Upper Peninsula. About 5,000 were held in the Lower Peninsula. Many of the camps were old Civilian Conservation Corps sites that had been left empty after the CCC ended in 1942. The camps were not exactly secret, but the government did not draw much attention to them. Officials had practical reasons for that. There were security concerns. There were fears about public reaction. There were also worries that families with sons fighting overseas would object to German soldiers being fed, housed, and paid in Michigan. Yet the reason the POWs were here was plain. Michigan needed workers. The draft had pulled men into the military. War plants were hiring. Farms, orchards, canneries, and logging operations were short of labor. The enemy soldiers behind the wire became part of the home front workforce. Michigan had 32 POW camps during the war, according to the Archives of Michigan. The list included places such as Fort Custer, Camp Allegan, Camp Autrain, Camp Evelyn, Camp Raco, Camp Sidnaw, Cairo, Croswell, Benton Harbor, Hart, Sparta, Owasso, and others. Some were large, others were branch camps used for seasonal work. Fort Custer, near Battle Creek, became one of the key locations. The Department of Veterans Affairs says more than 5,000 German POWs were held there during World War II. In the Upper Peninsula, the setting was different. There, former CCC camps became wartime prison camps. At Camp Evelyn near Munising, German prisoners cut pulpwood. At Camp Autrain, Camp Raco, Camp Sidnaw, and Camp Pori, prisoners worked in the forests. The contrast was sharp. Some of these men had been captured in North Africa. They had known desert heat, sand, and war. Then they found themselves in the deep woods of northern Michigan, swinging axes and saws in snow country. For many, Michigan must have seemed like another planet. The rules allowed prisoner labor, but not for combat-related military work. The National Park Service says the government leased out as many as 265,000 POWs nationwide to fill non-military labor shortages. Many worked in agriculture, meat packing, food canning, and produce operations. Michigan followed that pattern. The Archives of Michigan says about 60% of POWs in the state were contracted out for farm work, including fruit and other crops. In the Upper Peninsula, they cut pulpwood. We found a 1945 news clipping from the Upper Peninsula adds a vivid local scene. German prisoners from Camp Evelyn near Munising had been cutting pulpwood. They were being moved by Army truck when the vehicle overturned south of Escanaba on M35. They were on their way to Janesville, Wisconsin to pick tomatoes. The men had worked hard. It said they completed assigned tasks and competed among themselves. It also said they were paid about 20 cents a day. A German prisoner in that article reportedly told an investigator that he could cut 120 sticks of pulpwood in a day with one hand tied behind his back. It was the kind of boast a lumberman would understand. And that is part of what makes the story so unusual. In wartime, these men were enemies. In the woods, they were laborers. Around farms, they were workers. In some local communities, they became familiar faces. Not friends exactly, but no longer faceless. The treatment of POWs in the United States was governed by the Geneva Convention. They were fed, clothed, and given medical and dental care comparable to American troops. The National Park Service notes that many Americans believed the prisoners were being treated too well while American soldiers were dying overseas. That tension shows up in news clips from the Upper Peninsula. After the truck accident near Escanaba, a local family stopped at the scene. One of the injured POWs was taken to a hospital. A young boy reportedly wondered whether Germans would have done the same for an American. That small roadside moment says a great deal. Michigan families had sons in uniform. Some were fighting in Europe, some were dead, some were prisoners themselves. Then here, on a Michigan road, captured Germans were being taken to hospitals and cared for under American military rules. The public reaction was not always generous, but there was also another side. The Archives of Michigan says the German prisoners were, by most accounts, respectful and well-behaved, and that few escape attempts were reported. That does not erase the fact that they served an enemy army. It does not soften what Nazi Germany had done. But it does show the strange human reality of the POW system. The men were guarded, but they were also seen. They worked near farmers. They moved through rural towns. They picked fruit, cut wood, worked around food plants, and helped fill wartime labor gaps. And over time, some Michigan residents saw them less as invaders and more as young men caught inside a destroyed world. There are many oral histories and family stories across the Midwest about German POWs eating meals with farm families, talking with children, or forming bonds with local people. In mid-Michigan, German was still spoken by some area farmers from the old country, and POWs did work with them. But there is no direct evidence that war prisoners in remote Michigan towns lived with private families. They lived in camps, barracks, or guarded branch camps. They worked on farms, in forests, and in food processing jobs. Some had contact with civilians while working. Some later wrote to former employers. A few later immigrated to the United States. Did German POWs fall in love with local Michigan girls? Almost certainly, some relationships developed somewhere in the American POW system, but we were unable to find any verified source stating that this occurred. That does not mean it never happened. During the war, fraternization with enemy prisoners was restricted. A romance between a local woman and a German POW would likely have caused gossip, official concern, or newspaper attention. Some prisoners liked what they saw in America. Some wanted to stay. Some later returned legally. The Archives of Michigan says some POWs kept in touch with former employers after the war, and a few later immigrated to the United States. That is a powerful ending on its own. By 1946, the Michigan POW system was winding down. At Fort Custer, the last large group of German prisoners prepared to leave by special train. They were bound for Camp Shanks, New York, before being sent overseas. But not everyone was happy. Letters from home told of hardship. Germany was occupied, cities were bombed out, food was short, families were missing. Some prisoners feared they would not be sent straight home at all, but would be moved into labor assignments in England, France, or other damaged countries. The war was over, but punishment, uncertainty, and hunger were not. In Battle Creek, many prisoners had asked to remain in the United States and seek citizenship. Officials denied those requests. That is the emotional point we found. They had arrived as enemy soldiers. They were locked behind wire. They were marched to work. They were paid little. They were watched. And still some looked at Michigan, at its farms, roads, food, order and distance from the ruins of Europe, and wanted to come back. Not as prisoners, as immigrants. Not all of them left. At Fort Custer National Cemetery, 26 German POWs remain buried. The Department of Veterans Affairs says 16 died when their truck collided with a train after a work detail on a sugar beet farm near Blissfield. 10 others died of natural causes. That cemetery section is one of the quiet reminders of this chapter in Michigan history. These were not American soldiers. They were not Michigan boys. They had fought for the other side. Yet their graves remain in Michigan soil, part of the record of a war that reached far beyond the front lines. The home front was not only ration books, victory gardens, and factory whistles. It was also barbed wire outside Battle Creek. It was German prisoners in fruit orchards. It was pulpwood cut near Munising. It was a truck overturned on a road south of Escanaba. It was a special train leaving Fort Custer in June 1946, carrying men who had once been enemies, men who were now afraid of home, men who had seen America from behind a fence. The story of Michigan's German POWs is not a simple story of friendship. These were soldiers from a defeated enemy army. Their presence in Michigan came from war, death, capture, and the collapse of Nazi Germany. But it is also a story about what happens when history becomes local. A global war entered Michigan not only through factories and casualty lists, but through farm fields, lumber camps, and guarded barracks. The prisoners came to Michigan under armed control. They worked in orchards, forests, onion fields, sugar beet farms, and food plants. Some were injured here, some died here, some wrote back after they left. A few came back years later by choice. And at Fort Custer in 1946, as the last prisoners boarded their train, the question was no longer only where they had been. It was what kind of world they were going home to. For some, Michigan had been a prison. For others, it had become the first place in years where the future seemed possible. Thanks for listening. What bit of Michigan history would you like to see next?